Two of the greatest directors in Hollywood were Cecil B. DeMille and Erich von Stroheim. Both autocrats. One worked with the studio system, the other against it.
One immediately saw, I think, that to be different than other directors would be to his benefit. He threw tantrums all the time.
This is supposed to be war! Death! Hell! Destruction! Nada than this good picnic! I'm making this picture for the theater, not for the Oscars!
Erich von Stroheim, writer, director, actor. To American audiences during the First World War, the most sinister of movie villains. To audiences of the 1920s, the greatest film director since D.W. Griffith, an obsessive genius whose contempt for censors, producers, and shooting schedules was legendary.
So I came to his house and I said, all right, Van, where's the script? He came out with what looked like 2 telephone books, today's telephone, that thick. I said, Juan, you must be insane.
To critics around the world, an artist whose ideas were too big and too soon for Hollywood. Erich von Stroheim boasted that his films were 20 years ahead of their time, but today none exist in the form he had intended. Arrogant and self-destructive, he let the most fabulous career in Hollywood slip through his fingers. Long before the end, he himself had become the image he had created on screen.
He knew that he was somebody because he played all his life to be somebody, you know. Then he has made himself, you know. He's his own creation. He is his own father and mother. And that's what he wanted, you know. I assure you, then no friend, no wives, no mistress, nothing. Stroheim. Married to Stroheim. In love with Stroheim. But he paid the price.
He knew that in this town, in those days certainly, and I suspect even more today, you couldn't get away with just being anybody. You had to have a style, you had to have a position. And he invented one for himself.
The most uncompromising director in Hollywood, and the most self-destructive.
Erich von Stroheim was one of the few legitimate geniuses of the early silent days. He was a man of such vision, and he was so great a poet and an artist that he found nothing but trouble in Hollywood.
Erich von Stroheim was one of the few directors to act in many of his own films.
Well, he did a lot of things in those days that nobody else put on the screen. Like in The Wedding March, there's a lot of stories of getting the whole bunch of people on the set drunk and keeping them there for 3 days and having nearly orgies on the set. He had girls, and he didn't use any extras. He used pensionnaires of Madame Francis, which was a real McCoy as far as girls of ill repute.
Von Stroheim had come to New York in 1909, leaving Austria for reasons never fully explained. With little money and no command of the language, he was only one more immigrant out of many millions. But in this new world, he would not be just plain Erich Stroheim. Already his imagination had created a new identity and a title to go with it. At Ellis Island, he presented himself as Erich Oswald Hans Karl Maria von Stroheim. Von Stroheim may have gained a title, but his hopes were limited. He hung around the fringes of New York's German colony, taking whatever odd jobs he could. He enlisted as a private in New York's National Guard, but was dropped from the roles 2 months later. Finally, he landed a job as a salesman for Max Grab, an importer of fabrics and laces. He worked for a time in their New York offices and soon was made a traveling salesman. In 1912, he arrived in San Francisco. A gold rush boomtown disguised as a graceful European capital, San Francisco appealed to von Stroheim, who was still claiming to be a European nobleman. He lost his job with Max Grab, but stayed working at a variety of odd jobs. In the summer of 1912, he was a waiter and handyman at the West Point Inn on Mount Tamalpais. Here he met Margaret Knox, daughter of a prominent Oakland family. He quickly dazzled her with tales of his noble ancestry, and they were married a few months later. They lived down the block from Margaret's family on Oakland's 14th Street. In this modest rooming house, von Stroheim perfected his English and began to write. But there was little interest in his work, and he was still compelled to take odd jobs. After 2 years, the marriage began to deteriorate. Von Stroheim left town looking for work, and Margaret sued for divorce. 6 months later, he was in Hollywood, working for D.W. Griffith. 1914. As European armies faced each other in the first great battles of the World War, another war raged across the vacant lots and orange groves of Southern California. The Civil War. Here, D.W. Griffith was filming The Birth of a Nation, and for $3 a day, his army of extras refought the historic battles between North and South. Erich von Stroheim was part of Griffith's army, an Austrian immigrant who had come to America in 1909. This was his first encounter with the movies. In this spectacular fall, he broke 2 ribs, but succeeded in winning Griffith's attention. Von Stroheim joined the director's stock company at the Majestic Studios, serving as general assistant and playing anonymous bits. Years later, in a BBC radio broadcast, he remembered his days with Griffith.
I had the honor of sweeping his stages on Prospect Avenue in Hollywood. In short order, I became extra man, worked myself up to small parts, and the eyes of D.W. fell on me, and I was engaged as assistant director to John Emerson, the former famous stage director, under the personal auspices of Griffith.
In Old Heidelberg, von Stroheim played a small part and served as technical advisor. He had convinced Emerson that he was a graduate of the university. Then, like everyone else on the lot, von Stroheim was drafted into the production of Griffith's great spectacle, Intolerance. He played a small role and assisted with the art direction, contributing ideas that appeared in his own films years later. The erotic imagery of this villain's apartment. Mae Marsh's hopeful geranium. Back with Emerson again, von Stroheim began to win better roles. He played a snooping reporter in this Norma Talmadge film, and appeared in a whole series of pictures starring Douglas Fairbanks. He wore a black eye patch here to draw attention to his small part, a forerunner of similar tricks he used throughout his career. In 1917, as the fighting in Europe increased, America mobilized for entry into the war, and Hollywood joined in. A wave of anti-German feelings swept the country, and as a consequence, Fairbanks dropped von Stroheim from his company. But for an actor who could play a convincing Hun, the war created some new opportunities. D.W. Griffith was preparing a spectacular propaganda film, and von Stroheim appealed to him for a job. It was a turning point in his career.
It was Griffith who first realized fully the extraordinary opportunity the motion picture afforded for the making of propaganda. It was he who made the first and most important film for the Allied cause in the First World War, Hearts of the World. It was in this film that I acted as Mr. Griffith's first and personal assistant and military expert, besides playing the part of the German officer, the outstanding villain. To be working for D.W. Griffith at that time was the topmost honor that could be possibly conferred upon anyone in Hollywood. It meant prestige. It meant the chance around the corner. It meant everything.
Von Stroheim began as an actor at the studio of D.W. Griffith. During World War I, he worked for Griffith as military advisor and played a Prussian officer. A role that fitted him so perfectly, he played it for the duration. From the moment he appeared on the screen, Stroheim had enormous impact. He reveled in being outrageous.
He believed his press releases. The man you love to hate. He thought hate was more important than anything else.
One girl said to me one day, does he drag you around the house by your hair every morning before he goes to work? And of course, I thought that was absolutely ridiculous because he was a very kind person.
As an actor, Stroheim was always offering suggestions to the directors he worked with. This sequence contains the first hint of the Stroheim touch. A tiny detail symbolizes the corruption of innocence. But at heart, the film was propaganda. There had to be a villain. And the bestial Hun made the finest villain the movies had yet uncovered. The young officer in this scene is Erich von Stroheim, whose rise to fame was a direct result of the war. A bit player in Hearts of the World, he was soon playing important roles. He took his fiancée to see one of them.
The picture that he wanted me to see was called The Unbeliever. And he played a German officer. And I know one of the scenes that I saw was pretty tough. So I looked at him and I said, we better get out of the theater before the lights are turned on. When we went out together in restaurants and things during the war, people used to spit at us as they left the restaurant and said, no, we're not going to sit in the same restaurant with you. And then they'd throw French rolls at him, but they always hit me.
No one personified the evil Hun with more conviction than von Stroheim. He put his Austrian military training to use and acted as technical advisor as well.
Von had a strange sort of exhibitionism. It wasn't at all disgusting, or it was naive, and, well, it created that wonderful subtitle, A Man You Love to Hate. He adored being a rascal.
Audiences were convinced by such scenes. And not only audiences.
Von Stroheim had found a new image. They called him the man you love to hate.
The publicity department of Universal hit on a phrase, the man you love to hate, because in all the films he was making, he was always the villain. So that slogan caught on. It was perfect timing for him to play the arrogant, egotistic Prussian, a man who was uncompromising, unrelenting. I got to know von Stroheim, or Von, as I called him, as almost everyone did, and I came to my own conclusion on it, that he was not this hard, very difficult man at heart at all. I think the slogan, the man you love to hate, created an image that he found very worthwhile.
My role in the picture was an ambulance driver. We were shooting a scene, and Erich said to me, "Where is this ambulance coming from?" And I said, "It's coming from the front." He said, "As clean as this?" So he had riding boots and white kid gloves on, and he said, "Well," he said, "we'll come from the front then, if that's where you're coming from." So he gets a pail of dirt and puts his white gloves in the dirt, throws it on the side of the ambulance, and he says, "Now it looks like it came from the front." So I thought, well, there's a fellow that something's wrong with him. You know, I never see anything like that. But he did it to attract my attention. I didn't know what he had ever done as an actor. So he said, "I'll take you down to a little theater where one of the pictures that I made called The Unbeliever is being shown." When I got in there and saw that he was an officer shooting this old lady, I thought, well, we better get out of here before they turn on the lights.
By the end of the war, Hollywood was bursting with activity, but there were no more roles for Prussian villains. Again, an unemployed actor, von Stroheim tried to find work as a writer or director. He went from studio to studio with some scripts he had written, but no one was interested. Universal City was his last stop. Universal was Hollywood's busiest studio, a sprawling film factory built on the site of an old chicken ranch. Here, von Stroheim had worked in the heart of humanity. Now he hoped to try his luck again with a story he had written called The Pinnacle.
He told me the story one evening, and he said, "You think it would make a good picture?" And I said, "Yes." So he tried to see Mr. Laemmle to find out if he could direct the picture.
Carl Laemmle, one of the great giants of the motion picture industry, was a man who had tremendous vision. He was a man fascinated and interested in any new element that was brought to him. He was also a great gambler. He not only gambled at cards or at the races, he gambled on people. One could always tell him a good story or something that could be filmed, and that's how von Stroheim got to him. Von Stroheim was just a small actor in Hollywood, extra, and so, but he had great ambition, and he had written a story, and he was determined that Mr. Laemmle should make this picture.
Well, Erich gave him the story for nothing. He directed the picture, and for acting in it, they gave him, I think it was $200 a week.
Directing his own performance, von Stroheim moved away from the grotesque caricature of wartime propaganda. Now his aim was satire, and his target, the not-so-long-ago world of his youth, the world of Vienna. As Erich Oswald Stroheim, he was born in Vienna in 1885 to Benno Stroheim and Johanna Bondi. Though he was later a practicing Catholic, his birth certificate bears the seal of Vienna's Jewish community. one of the many contradictions clouding the facts of his early years. Stroheim's actual military record is unknown, although he was fascinated by the details and rituals of military life, an obsession which characterized so much of his later work. Before he was 30, Stroheim left Vienna, but never forgot the world of the Habsburgs. Again and again, he recreated it in his films, trying to recapture a bygone age. Never really a part of this world, he later rebuilt it across the backlots of Hollywood, often casting himself as the handsome prince.
Stroheim wrote a script for his first film as director. With a determination some saw as arrogance, he took it straight to the head of Universal Studios, Carl Laemmle.
Mr. Laemmle said, if I give you a chance to direct the picture, when you become successful, you leave me and go somewhere else. He said, I'll shake hands on that and promise you I will stay with you. So he said, all right, what's the deal? So Laemmle said, you give us the story for nothing, you direct the picture for nothing, but we'll pay you $200 a week to star in it.
This was the first time in films, said Stroheim, that a man casually followed his sexual bent. Having seen me only as a brutal German officer, the public greatly resented me and the sophistication of my seduction. This man with his dirty sex stuff should be deported, they said. I became infamous and notorious.
The picture was made for $42,000. And it made one of the first pictures to make over $1 million. The people were lined up for blocks to see it.
But in his first film, he was only a junior officer, with an eye on the wife of a vacationing American doctor. Neglected by her husband, the wife appears susceptible to von Stroheim's continental attentions. Innocent enough today, but for 1919, a temptation far beyond the conventions of Victorian melodrama. With this film, von Stroheim brought to the screen characters of true psychological complexity, whose actions are motivated by passion and guilt. The American cinema was growing up.
Von Stroheim ran into a very unexpected roadblock. Mr. Laemmle played a card game with his pals all the time called pinochle. And the resemblance of the word pinnacle and pinochle absolutely baffled him. He was afraid the public would mistake the new movie for having to do with a card game, and he refused to allow that title to be used.
Just before release, Universal changed the title of The Pinnacle to Blind Husbands. Von Stroheim was furious and published a bitter attack on the studio in the Motion Picture News. Carl Laemmle answered it the next week. It was the first of many quarrels between von Stroheim and his producers. But for the present, it was just good publicity. Blind Husbands was a tremendous hit. critics were astounded by the mature handling of the cliched triangle situation and the film's dramatic sense of realism. Some even thought it had been photographed in Europe. Von Stroheim was starting his career at the top. By the time Blind Husbands was released, he had already completed his second film, The Devil's Passkey. The setting was Paris, the world of high fashion, and the Comédie Française. Again, he told a story of Americans in post-war Europe and of a neglected wife involved with a handsome officer. This time, the officer was an American, and the critics were outraged. But most agreed it was a significant advance from Blind Husbands, with greater subtlety and imagination. Today, there is no way of knowing. In 1941, the original negative was found to have disintegrated in studio vaults, and no prints are known to survive.
Stroheim was rewarded with complete freedom to direct and star in Foolish Wives. The sets were on the scale of a Griffith epic. Universal City became Monte Carlo.
One day, Mr. Laemmle came to Erich and he said, "Why don't you make a picture about gambling?" So Erich had never been to Monte Carlo, but he said, well, that would be a good place to have the background. He built the whole Monte Carlo on the Universal lot. It was the talk of the town.
The production of Foolish Wives was a turning point in Hollywood history. The film established Universal as a major studio and branded von Stroheim as an uncontrollable spendthrift. It was called the first $1 million picture. Like Hemingway and Fitzgerald, von Stroheim was fascinated by the post-war phenomenon of the American in Europe. The foolish American wife, caught between a husband who cares only for business and a charming European rogue, discovers the flaws and virtues of each culture. The European may be glamorous, but also inherently deceptive and decadent. Von Stroheim sought to make this clear through his portrayal of Karamzin, a bogus Russian count whose taste in women is unhindered by American-style morality. While trying to seduce the American ambassador's wife, he is also involved with two so-called cousins, his serving maid, and the mentally retarded daughter of an old counterfeiter. Von Stroheim began in July of 1920. 11 months later, he had shot over 60 hours of film. The production was a nightmare. Von Stroheim constantly rewrote the script and often filmed dozens of takes of the same scene. Irving Thalberg, now production head at Universal, could only sit back and watch as von Stroheim meticulously put his fantasies on screen.
He was such a stickler for detail. There was a scene where they ate caviar. Well, in those days, they would put some raspberry jam in a dish, not von Stroheim. It had to be real caviar. I will know, he says, when I eat it, that's real caviar.
It was really Thalberg's baptism of fire with von Stroheim. There was a budget, there was a schedule, and von Stroheim blithely ignored them both. He liked to embroider his films as he went along. And as a consequence, when Thalberg tried to hold him down, von paid no attention. He just brushed him off. Von simply said, look, take me off as a director, remove me, and he removed me as a star. You won't have a film. Thalberg, therefore, was totally ineffectual in any fight, and he had to agree. And I will say that Foolish Wives turned out very well. It was very costly, took a long time, created lots of problems, but it came off so well. There's an old axiom, everything is forgiven if you have a good preview. Von had a very good preview.
Stroheim's films were always scrupulously authentic. He was fascinated with military detail, and his uniforms were correct to the last tunic button.
Juan was a tremendous stickler for detail. If things weren't exactly the way he wanted, he wouldn't shoot. At the time when he had rebuilt parts of the casino of Monte Carlo, absolutely to every detail. And when he came in to shoot the first day in the hall of the hotel, he suddenly walked over to the porter's little desk there, and he looked at the box where the numbers of the rooms showed up when somebody rang, and it didn't work. And he said, why doesn't this work? Numbers must show up. And I said, well, Mr. von Stroheim, you're so far away. I will not shoot until this is all set. Everything had to be in absolute working order.
Stroheim used every arc light Universal had. Lights had to be rented from other studios. The front office ordered him to stop. He had shot enough for 3 pictures. Stroheim ignored the order. The studio made the best of a bad job. As the cost climbed, they put it up in lights. Finally, producer Irving Thalberg ordered the cameras to be seized. After 13 months, shooting stopped.
But despite good business in the big cities, many were shocked by the film's brutal realism and its unflattering portrait of Americans. The film became a target for censors across the country, and just after its premiere, an entire hour was cut from it. Foolish Wives, and especially von Stroheim's notorious Count, soon became a national scandal. A favorite target of censors and pressure groups.
After the gala premiere in New York, Universal felt the picture was far too long. They slashed it by an hour. Despite an outcry that the film was an insult to the American people, they kept the most provocative scenes. Stroheim and the wife of the American ambassador shelter from a storm in a goat herd's hut.
His behavior in film was quite atrocious, but he had such charm and such innate modesty, actually, with all of his exhibitionism. And no matter how wicked he was in the films, people adored him.
Snub Pollard may not look much like Erich von Stroheim, but the volatile behavior is unmistakable.
It also became the butt of a Max Sennett comedy starring Ben Turpin. Ben Turpin's antics had little effect on von Stroheim, who was already deep into his next project.
Stroheim's films were bringing in a fortune for Universal Pictures. Thalberg gave approval for his next project, Merry Go Round, but warned him against unnecessary extravagance.
He served champagne and caviar, and by God, it had to be real champagne and real caviar. You know, that was quite a bone of contention at the studio. That upset Thalberg at the time terribly, that there were bills for hundreds of dollars worth of caviar being served. Usually they would have some jam that took the place of caviar, but not von Stroheim.
Thalberg decided that Stroheim's extravagance was inexcusable. He fired him. It was a milestone in the annals of the industry. Now the producer was in charge, not the director.
Von Stroheim was preparing a film which had an Austrian background. It was called The Merry-Go-Round. He had found a girl in Chicago who had won a beauty contest, Mary Philbin, and he had selected her to play the lead in it. And Norman Carey, who looked the prototype of an Austrian officer, played the lead. So he rebuilt parts of Vienna. It was fabulous how he really copied the Prater, the famous entertainment park.
With Hollywood's millions, von Stroheim rebuilt the Vienna of his youth in lavish detail. But this time, Irving Thalberg refused to allow him to act as well as direct. Foolish Wives had taught him that lesson. Instead, Norman Carey had been given the role von Stroheim had intended for himself, and Thalberg sent spies to watch the progress of the shooting. What they saw was a Vienna of corrupt sensuality and its nobility in the last stages of decay. Von Stroheim spent weeks filming these bedroom scenes, and as costs mounted, Thalberg began to receive warning signals.
When Merry-Go-Round was starting, Thalberg wanted von Stroheim to very carefully note that there were to be no added scenes. And I'm sure that Thalberg thought that von would take that to heart, but he wasn't the type who would. He was enough of a perfectionist that he wasn't going to be bound by things that he thought would hamper the perfection of his film. As soon as Thalberg saw that, they had a furious fight. Von Stroheim decided to take his case to Carl Laemmle, who was in New York. Thalberg had another director on the lot, Rupert Julian, and while von Stroheim was on a train chugging its way across country, Thalberg put the picture right into production with Carey and Julian. And it began to roll very well, so much so that when von Stroheim reached Carl Laemmle in New York, confident that his mentor would back him up, Laemmle had already decided, or did decide almost immediately, that he would back Thalberg. And von was in a spot. I mean, he had put himself in such a spot that it was you either do as I say or I quit. And he quit.
When the film was released, von Stroheim's name was nowhere on the credits, and only a few of his scenes were still in the picture. But they were pure von Stroheim. Von Stroheim's break with Universal shocked the entire industry. Never before had a studio so ruthlessly exercised its power over a major director.
June Mathis, creative head of Goldwyn Studios, disagreed. She believed that the director should have total control. She opposed the factory system and welcomed Stroheim. Stroheim saw an opportunity at Goldwyn to make the film of his dreams. He'd always wanted to film the brutally realistic novel McTeague by Frank Norris. He called it Greed. Here he demonstrates the scene to actor Gene Herschelt.
But other studios quickly rushed in with offers. Within weeks, he had signed with the Goldwyn Company and begun work on an adaptation of McTeague, Frank Norris's classic novel. He called it Greed. In Frank Norris, von Stroheim found an ally, a writer whose passion for realism matched his own. He became obsessed with the book and determined to capture every detail. Before this, his films had looked back to the Europe of his youth. Now, the subject was his adopted country, America. To film Greed, von Stroheim returned to San Francisco in 1923, leaving the studio far behind. He built no sets. McTeague's dental parlor was in this building, still standing on the corner of Hayes and Laguna. Von Stroheim felt that for the scenes to seem real, they had to be real. The actors worked in the rooms by day and slept in them at night. This rare footage shows von Stroheim directing a screen test of Gene Herschelt. And acting out the part himself while a group of musicians provide a musical accompaniment. The entire cast had to submit to tests like this, including Zazu Pitts.
The scene was Zazu Pitts on a bed in a negligee, counting gold pieces. And Stroheim wanted her to have an expression of great satisfaction by handling the money. And she really didn't know what he wanted her to express in the tests, and it took us take and take and take before he got exactly the scene he wanted. And poor Zazu said, I don't know what he wants. And he wanted her to look as if she was having an affair with an invisible person, you know. And poor Zazu was, you know, simple. But she got the part.
Greed. A wife wins the lottery and becomes obsessed with hoarding the money. She keeps her husband, McTeague, penniless. Zazu Pitts had been a comedienne. Stroheim tested her for the leading role. He wanted her to age with the story, but to start as an innocent young girl.
Zazu was supposed to count the money, gold pieces, and Stroheim wanted her to have an expression as if she had an orgasm and she didn't know what he was talking about. So the funny thing is, he was trying to show her how to do it by mimicking him. And we, of course, the whole company laughed, but he got his test all right and she got the job.
He photographed the book practically from cover to cover, and everything but the preface and a sub-story of a couple of dogs. And it was very truthfully portrayed and put on the screen, even to the locations.
Stroheim's use of location was revolutionary. For this doomed love story, he filmed in real houses, real streets. I felt the public had tired of the cinematic chocolate eclairs which had been stuffed down their throats, he said. I was going to people my scenes with real men and women who conquered their passions, or were conquered by them.
His attention to detail surpasses that of any director I have ever known or heard about. His sense of drama is absolutely exquisite. He will build to his climax, he will reach that climax, and he will let that climax subside only to be taken up by another wave. It's like the rollers coming in from a heavy storm.
The story told of the fate that destroys three simple Americans. The slow-witted McTeague, raised in a backwoods mining camp, but now working as a dentist on Polk Street. Marcus, a slick representative of the urban working class. And Trina, whose chance winning of a $5,000 lottery starts them all on the road to destruction. Von Stroheim's goal was a critique of American values. While other directors handled such topics only in the most oblique terms, von Stroheim went right for the throat. He attacked the most sacred of American institutions, the family. The marriage of Trina and McTeague is the centerpiece of the film. A sacred ritual, performed against a foreboding background. Marcus had earlier given up Trina to his friend McTeague, but that was before she had won $5,000. Consumed by jealousy and greed, he informs the state dental board that McTeague has been practicing without a license. With their livelihood gone, life for McTeague and Trina begins to deteriorate. McTeague drinks, while Trina's desire to keep her golden treasure intact grows to psychopathic proportions. Eventually, both revert to the spiritual and moral level of animals. As in the novels of Émile Zola, the human beast inevitably emerges. But Norris's novel did not stop in San Francisco. It went beyond, into the mountains, and so did von Stroheim.
When von Stroheim made his first trip into the mountains early in 1923, he came up here to the old cemetery. He had a man with him who seemed to be representing the Goldwyn Corporation. So von Stroheim explained to him how he would take the last scene first. He would show McTeague coming back after 20 years trying to find his mother's grave and finally stumbling on it. Then when he was sure that he had that scene wrapped up, he was going to clean up the cemetery, rebuild the facade of the church, and show the funeral, the first scene that was supposed to be taken. He explained it all in detail, and his manager alongside of him shook his head. He said, "No, Von," he said, "this is going to cost altogether too much money. Forget it." So Von did. Then they went on toward the Big Dipper mine. It had been shut down about 10 years when von Stroheim came up and leased the mine and leased the mine site. Most of the shooting was done at night, between 9 o'clock and 6 in the morning. We'd work all night on a scene that would probably take up 5 minutes, actually, in the theater.
McTeague now has a price on his head for the murder of Trina. Pursued by Marcus, he flees to Death Valley. Death Valley, the lowest point in America, a wilderness of aptly symbolic proportions. Despite the lack of proper roads, von Stroheim insisted the only possible shooting location was Death Valley itself.
The temperature was around 125 when we got there. And Stroheim used to walk around in shorts and gloves and a colonial helmet. I think he had a gun in case the rattlesnake came up. We were living in tents, and the temperature was about 90 degrees at 2 o'clock in the morning, so nobody could sleep. It was awful. One of the cooks on the company died. I think he had high blood pressure, and the heat didn't help. As the paint on the cars curled up and fell off, you couldn't touch a piece of metal, and Stroheim seemed to like it.
It was 42 reels when he finished. They showed it to all the press, took them all day long. They stopped for lunch, and after they got through looking at the 42 reels, they said they could see more.
I was present at one of the first runnings of the film. It was fabulous, but of course impossible. So von Stroheim had this idea the film should run in 2 parts. He would cut it down to 6 hours and run 2 parts in successive evenings.
I was in New York with Rex Ingham. They sent on the picture in 28 reels. After studying it for some time, I got the picture down to a 7-reel picture and an 8-reel picture. And ran it on New York roof. We had all the executives from Paramount and Metro. We ran the show there, and it was well liked by everybody, including Skank and Rex. And somebody from Paramount brought up the objection later. They said, well, the second half's a tragedy, and if they ever see the tragedy first, they'll never come back again to see the front end, which was quite humorous at times. And so anyhow, it came back to the coast, and what they released was, my opinion, a lot of nothing. It was ruined, absolutely ruined.
By the time MGM's cutters had finished, most of von Stroheim's masterpiece was in the wastebasket. The entire prologue, an hour or more in von Stroheim's version, was cut to only a few minutes. It showed McTeague as a young miner, the death of his alcoholic father, and his apprenticeship as a traveling dentist. Whole subplots were eliminated, parallel stories carefully laid out by von Stroheim as counterpoint to the story of Trina and McTeague. The story of Zerkow and Maria was taken out entirely, a grotesque parable of an insane junkman who murders his wife over an imaginary fortune, then commits suicide in San Francisco Bay. Only a few shots were left of the 2 old people, who somehow find happiness together while disaster strikes down everyone else in the cast.
At the end of the film, McTeague has murdered his wife, taken the money, and fled to Death Valley to escape the law.
Stroheim decided that Death Valley was the only place where you would like to shoot the picture. Because that was the only spot where you could find a piece of flat desert that would be so warm that you could see the air go up and ripple over the sand. So we went, and the first day temperature was 125. So the cameras were protected with covers that were soaked in water, and that water would evaporate in about 5 minutes, but it kept the magazines cool. And Stroheim, he had a very funny get-up. He was dressed in shorts. He had yellow gloves, and he really thought he was on the Sahara Desert. One of our cooks died, and 2 or 3 people got very sick. I didn't wait to get sick. I said, you better send me home.
McTeague's jealous friend, played by Gene Hersholt, has been made deputy sheriff and comes to arrest him. Stroheim yelled at us, recalled Hersholt, "Fight, fight! Try to hate each other as you both hate me." And that typified Von. To get realism, he would make you hate him. Stroheim's version of Greed lasted 42 reels.
To show Greed in its entirety would take all afternoon and all evening, and would be a long afternoon and a long evening. And it would exhaust any audience. He knew he was making a masterpiece. Every scene showed it. He knew that he was making a financial flop because the extreme length prohibited being shown in any theater. And unless the thing is shown in the theater for money and makes money, then it is a failure. No matter how good it is, it's still bad.
Now the Goldwyn Company merged with Metro and Mayer, an event which devastated both the film and Stroheim's career. 2 men dedicated to the factory system now controlled the company, Irving Thalberg and Louis B. Mayer. Thalberg insisted on Greed being cut from 42 reels to 10. Stroheim was appalled. A critic who saw the full version described it as the greatest film he had ever seen, but Thalberg's cuts were made. Carefully plotted motivations were removed, and with them sequences of beauty and power. Stroheim refused to look at the final result. The man who cut my film, he said, had nothing on his mind but a hat.
But if the studio intended to make the film more acceptable to audiences by cutting it so severely, they had made a serious mistake. Reviewers were nearly apoplectic with rage. The filthiest, vilest, most putrid picture in the history of the motion picture business, wrote one critic. In Austria, where Erich von Stroheim comes from, they may enjoy this picture, but I doubt if a single normal American can be found to feel that way about it. In 1924, neither Austrians nor Americans cared much for the film. But 40 years later, an international critics' poll named it one of the greatest films of all time. Being cut, the Goldwyn Company had become Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer, Hollywood's largest and most powerful studio. MGM's directors were the cream of the industry. Seastrom, Browning, Niblo, Caban, Hughes, von Sternberg, and von Stroheim. There were new faces in the front office as well. Louis B. Mayer was now head of the studio, and in charge of production, Irving Thalberg.
Thalberg came in when Greed was completing and proceeded to cut von Stroheim's masterpiece, that was some 6 or 8 hours long, into a palatable length for theaters. So everybody has to believe, if they don't know the facts, that von Stroheim and Thalberg were deadly enemies. That's not true. Thalberg brought him back to do The Merry Widow.
Stroheim was now just another contract director at MGM. He clashed with the front office again over his next film, The Merry Widow. He hated the star system, but was obliged to work with Mae Murray, the most temperamental star of them all. Despite furious rows, he turned in a film which was highly profitable for the studio. He loathed it. He marched out of MGM.
He was flawed by living the character he portrayed a great deal, too. He didn't have the saving grace of the Anglo-Saxon common sense, to put it bluntly. And he was always on, and he was always against the management, wherever he was. Didn't matter. And he was going to wreck them. If they thought they had suffered before, he was going to show them real suffering.
Von Stroheim hated the star system, but the studio forced him to use its most temperamental star, Mae Murray, as well as an up-and-coming romantic lead, John Gilbert. It was soon obvious that there was room for only one star on a von Stroheim picture.
They had the scene where they danced The Merry Widow. So Erich wanted to change something, so he went up to Mae Murray and he showed her, or told her how to do the step. And she says, "You dirty Hun, you think you know everything." So with that, he stood still, and then we left the set and went home. And we were home for a couple of days. And so they said, well, we're going to have another director finish the scene. Now, don't forget, all the people that worked for us in The Merry Widow had worked in other pictures. And they knew how to wear the uniform and also ride horseback. We always had the same people because they knew Erich and they were all friends. When they were going to bring the new director in, he came in and he said, all right, line up or get in your places. Nobody moved. So they knew that wasn't going to work because they thought it was an insult to him. So an emissary was sent from the studio to our home and said, you come back to the studio and we'll have Mae Murray apologize to you. Then he went back on the set, and there was so much yelling and screaming and whistling and clapping that the people from the other stages came over to find out what was going on.
Mae Murray took it very personally that he was turning the part of Sonia, the leading role, into a whore. And knowing that Maya had great reverent feelings about women, she reported what she felt von Stroheim was doing to the role that she was playing. And Maya was inflamed by it. Now, Maya was a very muscular man. He had worked for his father, who was in the junk business in Canada, and he handled an awful lot of iron and steel. And very few people realized what a good right fist he could swing. One of those who found out the hard way was von Stroheim, who went to see him when Maya called him up because of Mae Murray's complaints about the part he was getting her to play. And when Maya confronted him with that, Von said, she's playing Sonia, and Sonia is a whore. And that particular word was all that Maya needed to hear, and he swung at von Stroheim and knocked him down, and then literally threw him out of the studio.
Despite constant problems at the studio, von Stroheim completed The Merry Widow himself, and it became his greatest popular success. It ran on Broadway for over a year and helped establish John Gilbert as a top romantic star. But von Stroheim was no longer able to work for Thalberg and Mayer. He signed with Pat Powers, an independent producer, and began his great nostalgic homage to pre-war Vienna, The Wedding March.
Backed by an independent producer, Stroheim embarked on The Wedding March. Again, he shot enough for 2 films, only one of which was ever shown in the United States. Once again, he was taken off the production.
why did he do it? There's only one answer, and I can't guarantee it. But it is an inward impression that somewhere early in his life, he was visited by such very great humiliation, such deep inward psychic wounds, that there came in him an insane desire to use his genius as a weapon, and that he would use the beauty of his work as bait to make them put out thousands, then hundreds of thousands, then millions and more millions, until he had a beautiful, magnificent monstrosity that is worthless except as a curiosity piece. And he had his vengeance. He proved his genius, and he had his revenge all at one fell swoop.
Filming began in the summer of 1926. Again, von Stroheim assembled his familiar company of character actors. Von Stroheim himself was Prince Nicky, and Zazu Pitts, the crippled heiress he is forced to marry. There were no temperamental Mae Murrays on this production. For the featured role of Mitzi, he chose an unknown, an actress who had been playing in westerns at Universal, Fay Wray. No longer was the von Stroheim character a simple villain or seducer. Prince Nicky was his most complex creation, an ambiguous representative of all that von Stroheim loved and hated in the Vienna of his youth. The embodiment of old-world charm and elegance, he was the last representative of a dying race, doomed to extinction as the summer of 1914 unfolded. Again, von Stroheim was allowed to spend freely. 3 dozen elaborate sets were constructed, from a Tyrolean hunting lodge to the Palace of the Habsburgs. Von Stroheim was not recreating Vienna, he was reconstructing it, with an attention to detail that once more put him far over budget. Hal Moore, chief cinematographer on The Wedding March, remembered the production in a 1972 interview.
We worked like dogs. We had no union protection, not hours or rest periods or anything of that nature. Stroheim was a fiend for work. Many nights I never even got away from the studio. I'd just sleep for 2 or 3 hours on the set. We do many as 30 or 40 takes of a scene without any explanation why he wanted to do it over again. And he'd just say, well, let's do it again. He wouldn't give them any new direction or anything of that nature. I suppose he was hoping that out of this would come an inspired performance on the part of the actor that would give him exactly what he was looking for, and that each new take of the scene might get closer to it. Sometimes he'd just get up and say, oh, to hell with it, just print them all.
Erich had a love scene with Fay Wray, and it was under an apple tree, and it was in blossom, supposedly. But this tree didn't have any blossoms on it, so he had apple blossoms made, thousands of them, out of wax. And he had a whole crew working for days putting the apple blossoms, you know, on the tree.
But the Wedding March was not all sweetness and apple blossoms. Von Stroheim spent weeks behind closed sets, photographing bizarre orgies, scenes which have never been shown on any screen. The Wedding March never reached completion. As von Stroheim fell months behind schedule, Pat Powers closed down the picture. While the studio tried to edit his material into usable form, von Stroheim looked for work around Hollywood. He had already alienated Paramount, MGM, Universal. When an offer did come, it was not from any studio, but from a star, Gloria Swanson. For her independent production company, he would film Queen Kelly, an incredible tale of a convent girl who inherits a brothel in German East Africa.
Stroheim had one more chance. Gloria Swanson hired him to direct Queen Kelly. Joseph Kennedy backed it, but no matter how much money he poured in, Stroheim spent more.
We worked from 7:30 in the morning until 3 in the morning every night for 7 months. And on Saturday, he would say, now let's celebrate, tomorrow is Sunday. I said, what do you mean tomorrow is Sunday? Today is Sunday. And he had a big flask, about a gallon flask, and he would get my whole crew drunk.
Gloria Swanson played an orphan, abducted from a convent by Prince Wolfram, who cannot face his marriage to the crazed and jealous queen, played by Sina Owen.
He'd gone way over budget, and we had 20,000 feet that had to be cut down to 3,000. So, and what he started to do in the last part of the picture, not the last part, but the middle of the picture, the second third of it, was I knew sensible. Because in the script it said a dance hall. And by the time he got through and I looked at the rushes and everybody else did, they said, this is no dance hall. This is something else.
The young ones seem to be more interested in the era of the 20s than, let's say, my contemporaries. But they're especially interested in Queen Kelly. I suppose there's a curiosity about it because it was just never finished. And also the fact that it was directed by one of our great directors, Erich von Stroheim. Well, I've been asked a lot of questions, and I'm going to try and remember them. Had I ever worked, for instance, with von Stroheim before? No, I'd never had that pleasure. He'd made such great pictures, and I was rather in awe of this gentleman. I had never met him even socially. I suppose in the time that I was there, and I have to speak of the 20s, although I didn't leave until the end of 38 when I moved to New York, there were sort of stratas. And the people that I moved with were certain people like Mary Pickford, Doug Fairbanks, Charlie Chaplin, and that's perhaps because we all belong to the United Artists. Von Stroheim, I think, made pictures mostly at Universal and then later at MGM. And when it came to producing pictures myself, I had made, my first one was Sonia, then Sadie Thompson, and then I was looking for a story. And I cannot remember whether von Stroheim came to me or I probably sent someone to him to find out if he had something tucked away that he might want to do. And it was written by him, Queen Kelly. And I must also tell you, because I'm sure many of you don't realize that these were the days of, well, we had some scandals. And we had a man called Will Hayes. We called him the Tsar. And we were all in awe of him, because if he said no, we just didn't do it. I'm talking about censorship now. There was a great feeling around the country, too, that Hollywood wasn't just what it should be. There had been the Arbuckle scandal, there had been the murder of Mr. Taylor, the director, and a few other things that were not very attractive. And so it was that he and his office had to okay all of the stories that were made. I think there were also women's clubs and organizations that were trying to stop Hollywood from, here's an example. For instance, you couldn't show anyone knitting a bootie, because that would mean that one of the cast was pregnant, even though that was part of the story, where you weren't pregnant, that nobody had children, I guess. And such things as that. And people often said, well, why are you always making fairy stories in California? You don't have reality. Well, it was because we couldn't. Now the stage is something else again. And novels were, oh, well, I can remember, now I'm going to digress, and I mustn't, because Eleanor Glynn, remember, wrote the 3 Weeks, and that was considered a very naughty story in those days, censored, of course. Now, of course, I suppose they'd read it in kindergarten. But going back to Will Hayes's office, he had okayed the script of Queen Kelly, as written by Mr. von Stroheim. And Mr. von Stroheim was, well, he had a sort of mind of his own. So when he came to making the picture, he didn't follow the script just exactly. Now, since I was producing it and I was responsible for the money, because in those days no one, well, they still don't use their own money. They go to the bank or they go to some organization just for this sort of thing. I was responsible for it. But I was trying desperately not to have anything to do with the production. Oh, I might have said, yes, I think he's a nice-looking man, we'll have him for the leading man. Or I might have said, oh, I'm so glad we're going to have Sina Owen, because she was suggested. But beyond that, I tried to stay away from it and just come on the set when I was supposed to do my own scenes. So we did have 2 men that were going to supervise, in a way, in the background. One was named Barney Glazer. He had been associated with Mr. von Stroheim when he was making The Merry Widow. And he was supposed to be able to handle Mr. von Stroheim. I've heard about people being, following me around to handle me. We're all supposed to be some kind of pixies that need handling. And so we asked him to come on the picture to sort of, kind of in the background, watch that nothing went wrong. And then there was another gentleman by the name of Bill LeBaron. He was the first, incidentally, he was the first producer in motion pictures, because there was no such animal in the days when I started. And he was here at the Long Island Astoria studio. And he oversaw all of the pictures that were made. And he was a man of the theater. So between these two, they were going to watch Mr. von Stroheim. In other words, that he wouldn't digress from the script that he had written. Well, I have a few minutes. I'll come back to this. But in the meantime, I want to tell you something very strange that happened. The exteriors were made in Griffith Park, where so many of them were made from all pictures seem to go out there for exteriors. And the first scenes that you're going to see on this picture have to do with the convent girls, which I'm one, and the young Prince Charming. And while I was making up, or powdering my nose, they had built a tent for me for my dressing room. And I had with me a house guest. We had met at the S&A when I first started pictures in Chicago, and she was there in my dressing room with me. And also there was a little woman by the name of Anne Morgan, who had been brought over by Eleanor Glynn. And she was sort of my dresser. She was in a nun's costume. Because of her lovely face, they wanted her to be in the picture just as sort of atmosphere. Well, as I'm powdering my nose, waiting for them to call me, they had been doing some scenes with the prince. I was looking in the mirror, and I kept saying, oh, isn't this strange? I can't see this picture finished. Well, the little Anne Morgan, little tiny woman, said, oh, but madam, what do you mean? Are you going to die? And I started to laugh and said, no, you can't kill me. No, it has nothing to do with that, but I don't know what I mean. I can't see this picture finished. Miss Swanson, you're wanted on the set, and off I went. All right, time passes. Quite some months passed. I should think about 9 or 10 months. And meantime, my friend had gone back to Chicago and returned, and she's now in my dressing room, and instead of being on the RKO lot, where we finally made some interiors of Queen Kelly, we're now at Pathé, and I'm in my bungalow, And this girl, whose name is Virginia Bowker, said to me, "Gloria, you know, so much has happened since I went back to Chicago. Tell me, do you remember what you said the first day of shooting? You hadn't yet made your first scene?" And I said, "Well, besides a couple of thousand words, no, I have no idea what you're driving at." And she said, "Is Ann Morgan around?" And I said, "Yes, she's in my workroom, sewing room." She said, "Come on, call her." And I did. So Ann Morgan came in and she said, "Ann Morgan, do you remember what Miss Swanson said just before she was called on the set? She was in Griffith Park, first scene of the picture." Oh, yes, I do. She said, "Oh, I can't see this picture finished." And, of course, now the film rolls back in my own head, and of course I remembered it. And I thought to myself, well, maybe I've got a crystal ball in my head and don't know it. But, you know, I dwelt on that for quite some time, because here I was now in the middle of my first talking picture called The Trespasser. And actually, since The Trespasser, I have tried to finish Queen Kelly no less than 4 times. And so finally, I put a little tag that what you're going to see is an ending that I put on it because I wanted to release it to some of the theaters that yet didn't have sound equipment and let some people see it. And now, of course, it's in the archives. It's in all the museums now around the world, and many people see it, but not with the version that you will see. In France, they ran it without my ending, because I think von Stroheim preferred that, and he was then alive. And in England, if you please, they have found some of the cutout scenes in Africa, which were the censored scenes, and they've put that on the end of it. So there are going to be quite many versions, I imagine, depending on how many hands have been on it.
Any other director coming out of a disastrous experience like The Wedding March might have become cautious, but not von Stroheim.
I was director of photography on Queen Kelly for Miss Swanson, and the introduction scene of the picture was shot in exteriors at the Lasky Ranch, which is now a cemetery. And over a hill, we could see a group of convent girls, pupils, coming up the road. And from the other side, there was a detachment of cavalry of the mythical kingdom. So when they met with the prince of the country leading the cavalry, the girls stopped to curtsy to him. And while they were curtsying, Swanson, who was in the first row of the girls, her pants dropped on the floor. She got very embarrassed, got out of her trousers, rolled them up in a ball, and threw them at the prince, who was laughing at her. And he picked up, he caught the pants this way, smelled them and said, "Ah," and put them in his saddlebag. So Stroheim said, "This is fine, this is a marvelous scene." And I didn't say anything. I said, "Photographically, it'll be all right, Eric. See how everybody likes it tomorrow." So in the production room, Mr. Kennedy, Joseph P. Kennedy, who was backing the picture, saw the scene, and he said, "Mr. Ivanhoe, how do you like the scene?" I said, "The scene photographically looks beautiful." And he said, "But then what's wrong with it?" I said, "I don't know if you'd be able to show it." Meantime, Stroheim was kicking me in the shins one way, and Gloria was kicking me the other way, but I had already said it, so it was too late. And Kennedy said, "Oh, I guess we'll get away with it." Well, they didn't.
The first scene was only a warning. Von Stroheim's script already contained some of his strongest material, but each day he would improve it just a little, von Stroheim style.
The set was a 2-story set on the stage. Downstairs was a huge bar, as big as the bars in Tijuana, and they even had trees growing out of in the middle of the floor, And then up the steps was a long hallway. The first scene is of a sailor coming out of one of those rooms, tidying up his trousers, and the sailor goes down to the bar room, and there he meets Tully Marshall, who is the actual backer of the establishment. And he was a very strange character. In one pocket he had a bottle of cognac. In the other side he had a Luger strapped on, and he had ataxie locomotrice. He was shaking all over. And he decides that he should marry the girl. So he goes and has a long scene with the aunt, then says, I have to marry your niece. During the marriage ceremony where a black priest is marrying him to Gloria, all of a sudden tobacco juice came out of Tully Marshall's mouth and hit Swanson's hand. And she said, Mr. Marshall. And he said, well, this is what Mr. von Stroheim wanted me to do. So Gloria vanished, and 20 minutes later, Mr. Kennedy, who was in Florida, called up Stroheim and said, thank you very much, this is all, we don't want to use you anymore.
You have now just seen a little more than half, and I imagine we have spent about, up to this point in the picture, about $400,000, most of which you saw on the banquet table. Real caviar, real champagne, you can be sure. You know, which reminds me of Mr. DeMille. That's what he did. He never wanted anything fake, and so when I was wearing diamonds, they were not paste. When I was wearing ermine, it was not rabbit skin. And I have an idea that Mr. von Stroheim was trying to be like Mr. DeMille. At any rate, at this point, we had shot a great deal of film, because this is one of Mr. von Stroheim's failings of taking a scene, no matter whether it's cigars in an ashtray, and spending hours on it. And I think that's why we had probably spent so much money up to this particular point.
These sequences were cut from the film and never shown.
Tully Marshall was playing a very strange African owner of a place of ill repute, and he was going to marry Swanson, who was supposed to be a girl about 18, and he had one of those safari jackets, and in one pocket a lot of cigars, and the other one a bottle of cognac. In another part was a gun, and he was chewing tobacco. All of a sudden, tobacco spit ran down on his chin, and it fell on Swanson's hand. And she said, Mr. Marshall. And he said, I'm sorry, Miss Swanson, this is what Mr. von Stroheim wanted.
And so I walked off the set and said, no more shooting.
And she went to the phone and called the powers to be. I think she called Mr. Kennedy in Florida. He was our producer. And 10 minutes later, Kennedy called Stroheim and fired him. And that was the end of Stroheim and Queen Kelly.
We went from this convent period, when you saw me commit suicide, presumably, jump into the river, the story went that I was rescued, taken to the convent, and then the nuns told me that they had received word from my aunt in Africa, and I was to go there immediately because she was dying. So that when the prince wanted to find me, he only heard that I had gone to Africa, and The story continues in Africa. I would say that, according to the script, there was probably almost 2/3 of the story took place in Africa. Now, my aunt, when we took these scenes, was supposed to be the owner of a nightclub, a dance hall type of thing. That was the script that Mr. Will Hayes had okayed. But by the time Mr. von Stroheim got in there and felt a free hand, maybe those other two boys weren't watching him, it wasn't exactly a dance hall. It was sort of one of those things that they long ago closed up in the United States. I'm not sure where they have them now in the rest of the world. They used to be in France, but I don't think they're there either anymore. And you can imagine my consternation when I walked on the set and saw what was going on, and also it was early in the morning, and Marshall Tully, I think his name was, he always played rather creepy kind of characters, and he's chewing tobacco and dropping it on my hand. I don't think I would have enjoyed it even at 5 in the afternoon, so I excused myself, so Mr. von Stroheim excused me, and I went to my bungalow, and I called New York immediately and said, "We better get out here but fast," to the people who were concerned and who had been lending me the money, bankers. "I don't think we have a picture, because a lot of it's going to be on the cutting room floor, because Will Hayes' office did not okay this version, plus the fact that we have 20,000 feet of the first third, and how we're going to cut that down and make any sense, I don't know." And then I relaxed, and of course everybody rushed out there. There was a lot of hysterics and a great deal of... I never saw, incidentally, Mr. von Stroheim from that day until I went backstage, many years later, I think in the 40s, when he was doing Arsenic and Old Lace, and said hello to him. We never mentioned Queen Kelly. Wherever you are, von Stroheim, who knows? But it was a matter it was out of my hands because of censorship. So there's Mr. Will Hayes and he are both in the same place, I'm sure, and I think they ought to try and work this out, because now the way things go and what we see on the screen and television and in the streets and the newspapers, I think anything goes. So it would seem. And maybe if we're today, the dance hall problem would have been nothing. So I guess it's timing. And I've taken up a lot of time. And I'm glad to say greetings to you and thank you for watching, and happy hearts to all of you.
Queen Kelly was never shown in the United States. Stroheim's career as a director came to an end. After an attempt to make a sound film, he resorted to acting and eventually exiled himself to France.
Once again, von Stroheim was out. Swanson, minus a director, tried to complete the film herself. But by 1929, it was all unusable anyhow. The silent movie was finished. Talking pictures were taking over the industry. Now reeling from the twin disasters of the Wedding March and Queen Kelly, von Stroheim somehow had to re-establish himself in Hollywood. Unable to find work as a director, he made a fateful decision. He agreed to work as an actor in a low-budget talkie, Great Gabbo.
Ladies and gentlemen, I will now do the impossible. I will smoke a cigarette and drink water and at the same time use my voice. Very well done. All right, Herr Professor.
So it rains and blows und it hails and snows und the cockeyed bells all home. Ah, ah, ah.
when Von Stroheim really was more or less on the outs in Hollywood. I sold Mr. Laemmle the idea he should let me remake Blind Husbands with Von Stroheim directing. This was, of course, the time when talking pictures had already started, and everybody knew how talking pictures were to be made. So I sat in my office when the assistant director came running, and he said, "Paul, you better come over to the street where the bells are, because Von Stroheim is going berserk." "What is it?" I rushed over there. Here was Von strutting up and down, breaking his cane. Another assistant gave him another cane. He broke the other cane. That was his sign of extreme displeasure. I said, "Juan, what is it?" He says, "The bells." I said, "What is it?" He says, "You told me I have to select the bells, because over, when we're up there, the bells are ringing at 6 o'clock, and I have to have the bells." I said, "Fine, have you selected them?" "Yes, I want them all." I said, "Juan, you can have only so many. Tell us those, the sounds of which you mean." "What do you mean, the sounds?" "I want the bells up in Arrowhead hanging over the lake." I said, "You must be crazy, Juan. Why do you want to have the bells hanging over there?" "Because don't you know that bells sound different? The sound is different when it's over the water." I said, "That may be the case, but that's not how you make talking pictures, sound pictures today. We record the sound of the bells, and then we lay that sound over the scene." He says, "The next thing you're going to tell me that there isn't going to be a band playing while the dance is going on?" I said, "Of course, Juan, the band will not be playing. There will be a band, and they will pretend to play, but the music will be recorded separately and also put on a band." "You must be crazy if you think I'm going to direct a picture like this." I said, "Juan, the people have dialogue while they are dancing. They will be talking to each other. You cannot do it and have the music playing after me." Well, he just stormed off the set like a wild man. I knew eventually Juan would give in, but it never came to this, because 10 minutes later, I was called into the office of Mr. Laemmle. Mr. Laemmle was flanked by a whole retinue of managers, general managers, studio managers, and others. And he said, "Kohner, before you say anything, I don't want to hear anything. I want you to fire Von Stroheim. He is out. The picture is off." I had to go to Juan and tell him, "Juan, you surely did it this time. The picture is off."
Now there were few offers to direct, and Von Stroheim worked more and more as an actor. Again he played the man you love to hate, but this time without a uniform. In RKO's The Lost Squadron, he was a mad film director. Even opposite Garbo, he was still asked to play Von Stroheim. Finally, from Winnie Sheehan at Fox, came one more offer to direct. A story of Depression-era New York called Walking Down Broadway. To help with the script, Sheehan assigned a young New York writer.
I must tell you that when he called me into his office and told me this, I was in absolute mortal terror, because I'd known of von Stroheim's reputation. Not only his reputation as a very distinguished director, but as a man who made a lot of trouble. Von Stroheim had not done a talking picture. It was rather disgraceful, in a sense, that a man of his reputation and position had not been offered a picture, and I think Sheehan did it. I think Sheehan wanted it to be an enormous success so he could thumb his nose at Louis B. Mayer. Mayer had sworn a blood oath that Mr. von Stroheim would never work again, and Sheehan taking him was quite a surprise to the entire industry. In any case, he was very articulate about what he wanted in this play. It was a story of two boys and two girls who met and picked each other up on Broadway. Very American, very unlike anything he'd known in Vienna, I would assume, but nonetheless, he wanted to do it. He was determined that I would say and write down and indicate to Mr. Sheehan that this was the most passionate, sexual, violent love affair that there had ever been in the world.
When the picture was finished, it was previewed, and I recall very distinctly one of the most sorrowful nights I ever spent in my life when I went out to see the preview in Glendale, and in the middle of the picture where the audience started laughing. Well, they either didn't understand what Erich was trying to drive at, or maybe they were in a gay mood.
It was greeted with absolute horror. It was said of it, I heard somebody say it, it could only be shown to a convention of psychoanalysts. It was, for that time, the frankest, most open discussion of sexual relationships between people that the screen had ever seen.
The picture was brought back for recutting, and at that time, Saul Wurzel, who was, without any, let's say, artistic, creative talent like Sheehan, he was the one that was going to recut that picture, and when he recut it, it was called Hello Sister, which I never went to see because I didn't want to greet her anymore. I had enough of walking down Broadway.
What they did was to get Eddie Berg to rewrite it, to use his long shots, and I had my long shots. And then they just butchered it. They butchered the characterizations. What came out was sheer rubbish. It was criminal. It was absolutely criminal.
As Hello Sister, it was released with no director credit. Few critics noticed and fewer still remembered. Von Stroheim became a back number, a relic of the silent days. And his personal problems were just beginning. In the autumn of 1933, his wife Valerie was severely burned in a beauty parlor explosion.
I always remember my mother saying, well, when you burn, never run. So I stood inside of this booth, and everybody else was crazy. There were 60 people in the shop, and that's where all the stars went, Jean Harlow and all the rest of them. Now, I didn't know what to do. I just walked outside the door and stood in the aisle. And someone said, they were throwing those, when you get in the barber shop, they had those white cloths. They were throwing those on me, but someone said, here's a coat, take this and put it over her. And it was a star's coat. I could tell you who it is, but I won't. She says, not my coat. I was in the hospital for months.
I never saw a man so devoted in my life. He engaged a room there, and as a matter of fact, I spent, I believe, one night there with him drinking a couple of bottles of scotch to keep herself alive, while she was a question of give or take.
And I must say that Erich is marvelous. He lived with me in the hospital, and the first bouquet, of course, I couldn't see because my eyes were dripping with blood, burned, and was from Joan Crawford. She was one of my neighbors. Beautiful white basket of flowers. I had a room full of flowers.
In a desperate move to raise cash, von Stroheim was reduced to acting at studios like Mascot and Republic, producers of grade B westerns and melodramas.
I know you did it, and I know why you did it. You couldn't explain. Explain that! Explain! Go on, hit me. I don't care. I still say you poisoned him. Oh, go on, you murdered him. You can't take that out of me. You can't shut me up. You murdered him.
Murdered? Poison? What do you know about it?
In 1935, I was head of the story department of Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer and in charge of the writers as well. And Von came in as a staff writer. His mind ran toward dramatic situations. It ran toward sex. He was marvelous at coloring and embroidering character. He could give you wonderful pieces of business for the director. And I think that von Stroheim required money, and it was anything but moving down, which others may have thought he was doing, by coming on the writing staff. He gave great contributions within the office, in the conference, that would go on, and then probably someone else would go off and write. I won't say that he didn't want to write, because I'm sure he did, and the point is that he did turn in a script that was bought by the studio.
General Hospital. Emergency? Disaster call. Railroad smash out.
All students and graduate nurses off duty report immediately.
The master director and famous author, Erich von Stroheim, again has endowed the screen with a story of epic proportion. No namby-pamby romance this. It leaves to other pictures the flimsy plot of the philandering intern and the pretty nurse. and chooses the fresher, more vital theme of the rise of a great surgeon, his sacrifices, his mistakes, and his triumphs, and his quest for the one woman with whom he has his one chance for happiness.
When he was working at MGM, one Christmas Eve, I got a telephone call from him, and he said, hello, and of course at that time it was told to Beverly Hills, and I mean, these calls were a little expensive. And he says, I want to say goodbye. I says, where are you going? He said, I'm going to commit suicide. I said, what, commit suicide? Why? He said, you know what happened to me? He says, John Farrow and some other director, Bob Leonard, came in with a basket with money and a beautiful engraved chart signed by everybody on the lot, wishing me a Merry Christmas. He says, and I won't take that. He says, I don't want any charity. He says, they don't have to feel sorry for me or something like that. I'm going to commit suicide. I said, well, Eric, will you do me a favor? I said, before you do it, will you let me drive out there? I want to kiss you goodbye before.
So when he came, he said, well, Eric, he said, would you leave Valerie as disfigured as this with Joseph and just take the easy way out? And he said, no. We wrote each person a letter with a check. Some of those people returned the check. Clark Gable returned it 3 times. And I must say, the man that kept him out of work, like L.B. Mayer, his name is on the scroll.
Hollywood offered charity, but no more chances to direct. To support his family, he would have to go elsewhere.
He had a fortune teller in California, and he was very dependent on her, and he got an offer to come to Paris. I'd say this was in late, maybe during 35, and he was in very bad state. He didn't have a job. He had no prospects. His wife had been ill. His son had been ill, and he went to see the fortune teller, and he said, I've had this offer to go to Paris. She said, wait. I see in the cards that you will have another offer that will bring you great fame. You'll have another career across the world. Well, he was dubious about that, but he did refuse the offer. And a few months later came the offer for him to play the German spy in a picture which was called Marthe Richard, who was a French espion agent. And that's how he came to Paris. And then, of course, everything opened up. The next film was Jean Renoir wanted to take him.
Jean Renoir came to approach him to participate in The Grande Illusion. There was one part on one side of a German flyer at the beginning, and the picture went on. And then at the end, there was another part of a German, of a prison warden in a military fortress. And these two didn't have any connection whatsoever. And Eric thought that it wasn't good for his career to accept either one of the parts because they were really too small. He thought and thought and found a way of linking the 2 parts. When he got in the studio the next day, what he had was a complete corset. When you saw the man with this, you knew that he had been shot down, that his neck was broken, and it was the whole explanation in one frame.
Croyez bien que le métier que je fais à présent me repugne autant qu'à vous. C'est vrai. J'étais un combattant. Maintenant, je suis un fonctionnaire, un officier. Mais c'est le seul moyen qui me reste encore pour me donner l'air de servir ma patrie.
Je crains que ni vous ni moi ne puissions arrêter la marche du temps.
Croyez, je ne sais pas qui va gagner cette guerre. La fin, quelle qu'elle soit, sera la fin de Rothenstein et de Boieldieu.
On n'a peut-être plus besoin de nous.
Et vous ne trouvez pas que c'est dommage?
Peut-être. J'admire le soin que vous prenez de votre géranium.
Ne croyez pas que je sois devenu botaniste, mais c'est la seule fleur de la forteresse. Il ne pousse ici que du lierre et des orties.
When he walked on the set, Renoir just, you know, kissed him, embraced him, and said, "Ah, Erich, there is only one person in the world that really thinks picture, and you have done something fabulous for the film." And actually, I mean, that was really a find, because everybody remembers that silhouette of that man with the prothèse. From that moment on, Erich was the superstar in France.
Von Stroheim not only found a new career in Paris, but a new life and a new romance.
I was trying to start a career as an actress, and I usually got some little jobs through the agency, which also handled Erich in London, who was his agent at the time for Goldin, who said, "Look, you've got to go to the Claridges, and there you'll see Erich von Stroheim." When I arrived, von Stroheim just sort of, you know, looked me up and down. You felt totally naked. And then took my hands and said, "Well, with a better color of nail polish, I think you will do." And I said, "Do what?" And he said, "Well, first of all, take that letter." Well, that was quite a problem. Then after that, it was answer everything for me. Rewrite my, I've written this dialogue in English, you've got to rewrite it in French. There started our collaboration, so to say. He realized that I wasn't afraid of him, whereas practically everybody around him was. And he had a tremendous amount of work to be done, and nobody had the courage of going through it. I became strictly a von Stroheim object, that is, working morning, noon, and night for Erich.
Working in France, of course, there were a lot of fly-by-night companies then, and the weather was quite different than Hollywood. There were studios, but they didn't belong to any. Nobody signed for studio, they signed for film. And a great many of these people were none too honest, and he had been warned about this, maybe by his fortune teller. And he always demanded, before, in the morning, when they started, he demanded $1,000 a day, which would be something like $5,000 now, I guess, and a bottle of whiskey before he would go on the set. Then they would use him for, say, 5 or 6 days in a film and use his name, which they used an old trick, you know, and say this was starring him because his name was a great draw at the box office.
He played a Chinaman in Les Pirates du Rail, and he did look really Chinese. In one film, he had been badly burned, so he wore a half mask. In another one, he played a French couturier with a sort of a goatee and white hair. Erich never could just be indifferent about anything that he did, and even the smallest part was of great interest to him. In Sacha Guitry's Si Versailles m'était compté, he played Beethoven, and he really managed to look like Beethoven. He used to take a portrait of himself and then draw eyebrows, draw a wig, draw mustaches, and finally found his looks. But mostly he was inventing himself a past.
Do you remember me?
How could I forget you?
Colonel Matthesius. What a disguise. I didn't recognize you.
Neither has anyone else, I hope. Won't you sit down?
I switched from being a producer to being an agent. I opened my agency, and one of the first people that I tried to get to join me was Erich von Stroheim, who at that time had been in Europe and made some films in Europe. The first film for which we brought one over was a Fox film, I Was an Adventuress. Once he was here, there was quite a lot of demand for him. At that time, they made a lot of anti-Nazi films, and there was always a role that von Stroheim could have played. We tried to pick and choose, but once in a while, one had to do some films which he better might not have made.
I wonder, could I use it to kill?
He played some very interesting pictures while he was here, particularly the film 5 Graves to Cairo, which he made with Billy Wilder, and then, of course, Sunset Boulevard.
With considerable irony, Billy Wilder cast von Stroheim as Max von Mayerling, a great silent film director now reduced to working as butler to his former star, Gloria Swanson.
It was a great thing to have such a good part in an important picture, so he hated to refuse that, but he wasn't very sure he wanted to do it. He felt that it was a sort of lampooning of his own life. Finally, he decided to do it because he realized that there were times in his life, in his own life, where it was almost as sad as the part that Wilder was proposing him.
After Sunset Boulevard, Erich von Stroheim left Hollywood forever. He returned to France, where he lived and worked for the rest of his life, appearing as an actor in the films of others, preparing projects he would never direct, enjoying the company of old friends. With Denis Vernac, he left Paris and moved to the country, to this chateau. Here he worked every day, writing novels, collecting his memoirs, creating on paper fabulous new von Stroheim films, only on paper. For 25 years, he had directed nothing.
In Hollywood, you're as good as your last picture. If you didn't have one in production within the last 3 months, you're forgotten, no matter what you have achieved. If you live in France and you have written one good book, or painted one good picture, or directed one outstanding film 50 years ago, and nothing ever since, you are still recognized as artists and honored accordingly. They do not forget.
Just before his death, Erich von Stroheim was awarded the Legion of Honor. In films, his decorations had always come from the prop department. Now, the people of France had given him their greatest honor,